Welcome to Series 1 of Pod Talks. We're here with some interesting individuals, so thank you for joining us today. I'm here first and foremost with my trusted lieutenant in Tom Davis. Tom, how's it going?
It's going great, thank you. Great to be here as well. Thanks for having us.
And tell us a little bit about what you do, Tom, and why you're here and what you are trying to achieve in general.
Yeah, okay. I trained as a secondary school maths teacher, and 6 years ago I set up franchised education centres across Yorkshire and Lancashire, and thoroughly enjoying doing that at the moment.
Excellent, thanks Tom, and we'll learn more about Tom as the session goes on. We've got some excellent information that he's researched for us. More importantly, a very warm welcome to our guest here, Simon Shepard. How are you, Simon?
Very good, thank you. Lovely venue.
It is, isn't it? I love
lovely
these
venue.
sort of Tudor effects. That's what really...
Very oldie worldy, isn't it?
Oldie
Oldie worldy.
And hopefully it gives us the correct sound as well. You know, it gives us that whole sort of synergy, which is fantastic. So, before we get into the nitty-gritty and learn more about Simon, who's taken his time out to come and join us today, I'm going to pass you back on to our trusted lieutenant, Mr. Tom Davis, because he's done some research on people, organisation development factoids.
Big time.
Over to you, Tom.
Okay. I thought I'd start with the modern learner. It's a fast-changing environment, and I wanted to know how the modern learner was spending his or her time. So I've got a bit of a breakdown. It's not everything, so don't start adding stuff up, but here we go.
See what we've got.
So it says here the modern learner will spend 33% of their time in meetings, 25% of their time on emails, 5% of their time being interrupted, and 1% of their time being set aside for learning.
So we're talking nearly 50% of people in the workplace with two big chunks of emails, which isn't pretty much, you could argue these days, is not really that effective, and meetings, and these days, you know, how effective are meetings, what we're trying to achieve from that's nearly 50% of the workplace. That's incredible, or time spent in the workplace.
And that's new learners. And if you go to middle management and above, and you ask them what percentage of your week are you on email or in meetings, you normally get to about 120% a week, which I didn't think was possible, but that's where you get to.
Which is an interesting point when we come on to a little bit later. We've got a question for Simon, which is linked around, you know, what skill sets are required for CEOs, for an example, you know, and if there's that 120%, where do they get that 20% from? You know, it's incredible, isn't it? So brilliant. Anything else?
Yeah, well, again, tied into that, I did look at reasons why people join certain organisations, and number one, by a significant margin, was they wanted to join organisations to learn. And so there was a bit of a disconnect between that 1% of time set aside, which doesn't take into account learning organically through your job role, but only 1% being set aside seemed startling to me. So yeah, number one reason, only 1% set aside. And yeah, again, the last factoid that I want to bring to the table on this topic is that 94% of employees would stay in a company if they felt that they were having their career invested in. So again, there's a retention element as well.
And that's incredible, isn't it? 94% of people in the workplace want learning, they want to explore and develop, and you've got to look at that and think, well, you know, that is a big percentage of people that need to get from A to B, and how many organisations are helping that or hindering that depending on their people policy. So that's incredible, isn't it? That means people want to absorb. And I think I read something the other day, which was some information that you'd found, which was how people want to learn, and there's a lot of push on e-learning, which I think is actually coming back the opposite way, and I think most people wanted classroom stuff, and they wanted on-the-job training, didn't they? So that they were two high percentages, which you'd normally think it would be the opposite. You'd normally think it'd be e-learning. But brilliant. Is anything else from your side, Tom, or is
again, it's all about the percentages for this first episode, but only 13% at the moment can access learning directly related to their job.
Interesting. So what does that really mean? What is that getting at?
It's just a factoid.
You're the mathematician.
It's just a number.
You're working that one out.
You brought
straight
Simon
away.
in to
The
kind of
mathematician.
take that number.
Stato.
And talk about it.
Exactly. Is our on-site Pod Talks in-house stato. That's
numbers,
what we want. Super, brilliant. Thank you, Tom, as always. Very legendary. And
Thank you.
Thank you for your help on that. And I think what we're looking at there is there's a lot of information research out there on how people self-actualise and how people get from A to B through their career, which leads us nicely on to our guest speaker, Simon Shepard, the one and only. This guy's got a very interesting background. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of what you do, and obviously before we get into the nitty-gritty of the three questions we've got posed for you, is let's quickly talk about you. So could you share with us your background from a personal, professional perspective? Where did it all start and where have you got to today?
Well, it all started in 1965, which is a long time ago, in London. That's where I was born. But I guess you're probably more interested in where it started in the world of work. So I'm a physiotherapist by background, and I've been head of health and performance at Lord's Cricket Ground for the last 29 seasons. And I've always been someone who likes to juggle a few things, maybe a little bit impatient about life, etc. So at the same time as sort of running things at Lord's, I set up a company called Optima-life about 12 years ago that really looked to take a technological approach into performance and the human and the humane side of performance in businesses. So over the last 12 years I've been gathering lots of data and telling people lots of stories using their data, and then running learning programs and hopefully allowing them to be a bit better a bit more often. And then the last piece of the jigsaw is something we're doing locally here in St Albans, which is, along with a couple of doctor mates, founded a brand called Living Life Better that's really looking to deliver what I've been doing in corporate organisations into just anyone. So it isn't just the exclusive right of the C-suite.
Which is a superb background, and we'll come more on to Living Life Better a little bit later on down the programme. But back to your time at Lord's, head of performance and wellbeing, that must have been incredible. Who were you looking after? Was it everybody behind the scenes? Was it also the teams? What
sure. So my role really evolved. So when I started there, I was there to look after Middlesex and MCC.
Wow.
I was a department of one.
Really?
And I was very lucky because I arrived, and then probably about 5 years later, all of a sudden sports science and sports medicine started to grow. And here we are a week after England won the World Cup, and if you think of the support staff for that England team, it probably outnumbered the playing staff. Every team does it. It doesn't guarantee you win. You're just trying to hopefully provide the support for your assets so that they can be successful. And maybe some teams might do a little bit better than others, and it might be a contributing factor, obviously not the sole factor, but a contributing factor towards success.
And what point did that change? Because obviously you started out being the only person, and even in other sports, as you know, you've got 25 people back of medicine or wellbeing of that squad of 25, if you like. It's basically one-on-one in some respects. At what point did you see in sport, in particular cricket, that whole change from that one or two people to a huge team?
I think the mid-90s saw that sort of advancement. Sports science became more prolific at university level. People were coming out of universities with degrees. What do we do? Well, we can actually impart our knowledge and learning in with other people. And I think also there was the stakes rose. If we think of the rewards for being a successful cricketer or footballer or rugby player 25 years ago compared to rewards now, that the stakes are very different, aren't they?
Huge, and in particular, football, for an example, the millions and millions of pounds that are involved in that is absolutely incredible. So everything matters, doesn't it? And these days there's nothing unturned. But you must have had some interesting stories from that time as well. And is any particular stand out that you'd be happy to share in regard to when you're in them physio rooms, or anything that you think that that you thought to yourself, wow, that was a moment in history?
There are a lot of stories I can't share in the podcast.
Exactly.
I think the main story, and this is probably a bit of personal reflection, is I was very privileged to sit in a dressing room with some successful teams and some not so successful teams, and here we are talking about learning. That was the foundation for my learning. For 10, 11 years I watched the dynamics of people. I watched leaders, I watched coaches, I watched subordinates, I looked how they interacted, I watched what happened on the field, I watched how they looked after themselves off the field, and it sort of really opened my eyes out to what could be achieved with maybe people who aren't real geniuses, but if you actually become together as a really coherent group, you can often do some really special things.
Yeah. I think that's incredible to hear, because you've seen it and you're talking there on the job learning or on the job training, aren't you, in some respects? which is what we talked about on the factoids, which is quite an interesting link. But from a point of view, you mentioned their teams, you've seen successful, unsuccessful. Just briefly, what would you say, what things would, if you pulled out from that experience, that you think to yourself, I've got a good idea what makes a good team now, or what doesn't? What sort of skills, facets, characteristics do you think that you came across?
I think 2 or 3 things. So one, if we're talking about a team, it involves people. And we don't need to have the same approach with every single person in the team. Generic recipes don't work when it becomes to complex relationships. You know, you're going to have some people who are driven by certain ways of working, others by other ways. So we possibly dilute the effectiveness if we just say, you know, one hat fits all. The other one is the importance of culture. Creating a culture around conversations and clarity and camaraderie. So I'll tell you a story. There's a chap called John Buchanan. John Buchanan coached Queensland. He was the coach who took Queensland to their first Sheffield Shield. And Middlesex had been coached by a chap called Don Bennett for a 20-30 period beforehand, who had an incredible legacy. When Don retired, and Don was the most fantastic coach, but when Don retired, all of a sudden we had this major transition. What do we do? So the world was scoured, this chap, John Buchanan's name came up, and I was very privileged that I shared a room. I roomed with John Buchanan for the season that he was with us. But his culture was totally different to Don's culture, which meant that the players here possibly struggled with the culture that he tried to introduce, and it ended up being a culture clash. And therefore we didn't have great results or effectiveness. And to cut a long story short, I think John felt it probably wasn't the best place for him, and it wasn't working. I think what's really interesting is that, and then John went back to Australia and became the coach for the most successful cricket team that we've ever seen.
And what would you put that to, since you saw that 2 different types of cultures? Would you say that he's more conditioned to the culture back home, so more people went down that path, so it was easier for them to connect? Or would you say it's a cultural difference as diversity from nationality and such?
I think it was partly luck. I'm not sure it's diversity and nationality. I think it was partly luck. But when you have someone who comes into an arena that's been dominated for 20, 30 years by someone else,
right,
that's tough. Let's think of football. Let's think of Ferguson. You know, you had another example there. It's almost the poison chalice, isn't it? The person who comes in after that.
And we're then into change, aren't we? You know, and therefore, I remember when Ferguson, for an example, left, I thought it's going to take 2 or 3 managers because it's a change process. And look where we are now until they won a trophy with Mourinho. So that's a fantastic point. And it doesn't matter who goes in, does it? Unless you could align similarities of culture. But is that going to bring you success? Change could be good.
Well, sometimes it takes time to get that cultural shift, and in sport we don't always have the time to, because we're judged very, very quickly. So it is a challenge, that, isn't it?
Huge. I love how you've picked up on a couple of things there, culture and teams and working together and stuff, and we'll touch more back on that, but you had something there, Tom?
I'd be interested to know perhaps an example of something that's transferred really well from your work within sport to your successful business career. What are the lessons there that perhaps have transferred particularly well, and maybe an example again I'd be interested in.
Can I flip it? Can I go what's worked well in the world of business and put it back into sport?
Do it, yeah.
Okay.
Because I think it's quite interesting, a lot of people in businesses will say, we must go to sport because they teach us so much about success and winning and everything else. And they do, and that sort of thing. But if I go back 15 years ago, I think businesses were ahead of sport when it came to setting a vision, understanding a bit more about purpose, creating clarity, having strategy, and understanding the processes behind that. I think sport teaches businesses a little bit more about maybe the physical and the psychological skill sets that can be used to achieve those things.
Wow, really interesting. I've not thought about it that way, because I've obviously been from a sport background as well. I've always gone, business needs what we do in sport, which is collaboration, which is working together, which is high functioning teams, and all that benefits an outcome, and that outcome is success. But you're right, it's really interesting to see from a business perspective how, you're right, with the values and purpose, that's very mapped out clearly these days. If you can apply it or not, is the interesting aspect, hence the two can be very strong when they come together.
And if you go back to the last point we were talking about, legacy, which is really the challenge that existed there. Legacy is often spoken about in businesses in terms of what's our legacy strategy here. How are we going to create sustainability and stewardship in sport? Maybe starting to, but maybe 10, 15 years ago I wouldn't have said it was.
And just briefly before we move on to some more questions for you, because I think it's fascinating what you talked about in your background. I remember I was listening to Andrew Strauss after the Cricket World Cup a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that up until the 2015 One Day International World Cup, where England didn't do very well, he was fed up of the culture in British cricket, and he actually was then given the task to put things together, and he broke everything down and built it back up to make it the success as it was. But it was interesting, he was given that opportunity, but secondly it was interesting in his vision and how he would do that, having spent a lot of time in sport, but obviously doing certain aspects with business as well. So I think potentially, if there's more reading to be done there, but potentially he brought sport and business together, which I think could be quite
and done a fabulous job as well.
He has,
absolutely fabulous job.
Yeah,
super stuff. If I can push it forward a bit, just looking at timings here and project forward really for Simon across maybe short term, medium term and longer term in terms of your work now and what you aim to achieve over various time frames. I'm aware that you've recently started a new venture, and I'm also interested to hear more about Optima as well.
Sure. So Optima, we really just try and help teams become more effective, and we do that by opening up conversations. And there are probably two key conversations we try and open up. One is how can I look after myself a bit better?
Yeah.
And the other one is how can I look after my people a bit better?
Yeah.
And we are looking at both the human and the humane side of performance.
Yeah. And
we will be really focusing on what I call KHPI.
Right.
How many businesses have KPIs, key
Yeah.
performance indicators? That's great. That's KIP. Yeah, we've got a KPI as well.
That's it. Transposition.
That's right. But a KHPI is a key human performance indicator.
Right.
And these are the factors that for me are the catalysts that allow one to achieve the KPIs. There's so many people just get obsessed by where they want to be over there. That's my KPI at the end of the quarter or the end of the year.
Yeah.
How am I going to help myself achieve that? How am I going to help my team achieve that? How are we going to master the KHPI?
So the KHPI, that's really interesting. So because it's very hard to measure something which is non-scientific to get people to perform, isn't it? And one way businesses do it these days is NPS, Net Promoter Scores, don't they?
Yeah.
Which at first when I looked at that, I thought that's pretty impressive, because obviously in the UK, 8 to 10 means your customer's happy, you're doing brilliant. 5 to 8, they're okay, and 5 beneath, something's not right. But then that's data, isn't it, which is so important these days. But then you think to yourself, well, how can we capture somebody's emotion, in particular if it's your guest, your customer? Well, the only way we can do that is through relationship, isn't it, and through conversation and everything else. And I would just wonder if there's ever going to be a measurement on how we look at people's performance from a psychological perspective, and also our guests' customer behaviour. I wonder if there's anything where we're going to get to that point where it's actually a real drive to understand.
Well, I think we've done a little bit on that actually, Graham. So I'll tell you a story. We were involved in some work that was done with a car manufacturer, and they wanted to understand a whole load of factors around selling. And we use monitors to capture physiological data, and we were putting those monitors on both the salespeople and mystery shoppers who were coming.
And you brought one in for us today.
I did bring one in, so
Which
it's
is
the first big
superb.
bodyguard monitor. I'm wearing one at the moment, so I produced my data on that as well.
Okay. Superb.
But what was interesting is we sort of discovered when was the hardest time to sell a car? Was just after you'd sold one.
Right, interesting.
You know, the sales script went out the window, the body language went out of the window, and the data as well. We showed a really significant increase in arousal within the people. So in the same way in sport that you try and get people back into the moment to play the next point at tennis, or take that penalty kick, or bowl the next ball or whatever, how could you use that with salespeople? so that they become more effective and more efficient in selling, in this case, more cars.
So just tell us a bit about this first beat then, and how that works, and then how you can measure that, because a lot of it is linked to the heart, right?
Yeah, okay, so what we measure is something called heart rate variability. A quick physiology lesson, only 30 seconds. So heart rate variability is a product of our autonomic nervous system. Our autonomic nervous system controls all the things we don't think about, like our sweating and our digestion and our blood pressure. And when we're loaded or stressed or aroused, what happens to the heart is the sympathetic branch becomes active and our heart starts beating like a metronome, 1 beat every second. So we can have a heart rate of 60, but it just beats with great regularity. And the opposite state is parasympathetic, and that's when we start releasing our recovery hormones, when we start looking after ourselves. We can still have a heart rate of 60, but our heart beats quickly for 5 or 10 seconds, then slowly for 5 or 10. Quickly for 5 or 10, then slowly. So identical heart rates, but 2 totally different patterns.
Wow. So you're measuring that through this, and then I guess you're then going to the aspect of what happened at that point when we had this peak or trough.
Exactly, and when people wear the monitors, they keep a diary through their phone, and then we produce a report that matches their story against their physiology. So in many ways, this is a biopsycho approach.
So you are the solution, Simon.
Well, I'd like to think so, Graham, but you do know.
You
I'm
are
sure there are
answering,
people who don't think that.
You are answering the question that's been in my mind as a learning practitioner for 25 years, and that's bringing something from sport into the business world. And your example there with sales in a car manufacturer, just imagine that can go anywhere, can't it?
Yeah, and it has. So, over the last 12 years, that was one project we worked in. But the ones that really make me sort of warm and gooey inside is the stuff we do with, for example, the NHS workforce, to help them look after themselves, so they also not only provide a great service, which they already do, to their patients, but provide a great service to themselves.
Superb.
So you are wearing one of these now?
I'm wearing one of these
so
now.
Could you tell me what your heart's doing? Right.
No, I will do it all retrospectively.
Oh, fantastic.
All retrospectively. Yeah. I don't really want to be interacting
no,
with it.
I understand
I'm going to affect it
now.
That sort of thing.
Yeah.
I want to do.
Have a look back at that.
And I mean, I've had a look at your information as well, and it's quite impressive, the report that you give, don't you? It shows you through what's gone on at certain key points, and very detailed, and it's very safe as well. It's important to highlight that, isn't it? You've spent a lot of time in getting it to that point, which is brilliant. So I'm a great advocate of that. I think it's something that, in particular from a wellbeing point of view, hopefully this is what business is going to do, is to drive more, let's really take a step back and think about our people performance, and let's get the best out of them, which in turn gets the best out of the organisation, doesn't it? It's got to come hand in hand. So a couple of more questions. I think one other question I just wanted to go back to briefly was, in a nutshell, could you give us your personal, professional career highlights, if is there one or two, and think back from when you first started out to where you are now? What personally and professionally, what really is a highlight for you?
I'm going to go for 2 or 3 if that's all right.
Superb.
So I'm incredibly proud to have worked at Lord's Cricket Ground for nearly 30 years. I loved cricket when I was a lad, so I really applied for the job thinking getting a letter back saying no would be framed above the mantelpiece, so I got lucky, so that would be one highlight. I'm proud of the award. We won a Medalink award for the work we did with the NHS.
Wow.
So I'm proud for what we did there as a team, and I'm proud of the fact that I've stuck to my values all the way through. So that's a very selfish one, but I've stuck to my values, and I've stuck to my purpose, and I've stuck to what's important, which is always about challenge and forward thinking.
What would be your values then? What are them principles you stuck to?
My values revolve around challenging boundaries, thinking how we can do things differently. Salutogenesis, which is a philosophical position really, which really revolves around promotion. Let's think of the NHS, or not just the NHS. Let's think of Western healthcare. It tends to kick in when people are unwell. In fact, the NHS is brilliant when people are unwell. Maybe the last few years we've seen increase in prevention. But actually, we need to be promoting everywhere. We've become very good at keeping people alive, but we just haven't necessarily become so good at keeping people alive with good mental or physical health. We need to be promoting from a younger age.
Yeah, I think I'd totally advocate that. I think that's incredible. And being able to apply your values to achieve what you've achieved is impressive, isn't it? Because sometimes we can lose, particularly in business, we can lose who we are, or we could lose what we're trying to achieve as a person. And I've certainly seen that with my time, is that you can see individuals that just become different, and maybe that's the culture, maybe that's a default position, maybe that's stress.
And going back to the physiology, we often see this. We see physiologically some really tough responses when people are doing things that are not aligned to their values. They're leading a life here, and yet their underlying values are there. And maybe this is one of the key things that we need to be thinking about when it comes to the mental health agenda.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is such a disparity between the way we live and the way we want to live.
Absolutely. And then there's the generation, or not the generation, but the societal pressures that put us into materialism, consumerism, and that it then can draw us from that value. And certainly from a mental health practitioner's perspective, you see this all the time, and this is really interesting for people to then take control and make decisions to help improve their mental health, their mental well-being, which I think is fantastic. So thank you for sharing your personal and professional. I think that's superb, Simon. And one final question from me then. So if we consider, and you can think about this in your own personal situation or people you've met, but let's try and consider two people today. Let's try and consider the 18, 19, 22-year-old right now in today's society, trying to get on in the workplace, trying to do well. And then let's consider somebody really senior, chief exec or managing director. So if you can think of them two spheres or spectrums, that'd be really, really good. If you could share with us what you think would be the skill sets you would encourage them to adopt in today's society to succeed, what would that be? Would there be any sort of transparency and togetherness on that, or would you say that there'd be two different skill sets?
I think there's a transferable skill set which revolves around communication. So for me, the younger people potentially need to practice communicating with their mouths, not just with technology. Relationships are born in lots of different ways. And I'm sure my mobile phone will have body language on it someday, but I think communication, what's it, about 80% through our bodies and 20%? We need to create
7%
conversations with people in person. So practicing how we speak and talk and move, etc. That would be that one. And then for the leader state, I think it's changing. So I think the leader of 10, 20 years ago was working in this hierarchical model that I'm at the top and we push down. And I think the leader of today actually has to be able to deliver a skill that in broad terms could be considered adaptability. And they're often in the middle of the circle now. So it's not at the top of an arrow going down, it's in the middle of a circle, and there's chaos going on all around it, and we've got to be able to communicate and delegate and bring people together. It's almost like Captain Kirk in Starship.
Exactly, and I think they're brilliant points, that communication piece. But going back to the communication piece for the next generation, because I think it's such an interesting time in the workplace, because we've got 4 different generations vying and fighting with each other metaphorically on how they're trying to understand each other, and there's a lack of understanding there. I just wonder your comments from a perspective of they need that verbal communication, the younger generation coming through. Is that a generation sort of stigma thing, do you think? Is it because we want them to do that, because that's what we had to go through, or can they get by without that verbal communication and assessing body language and stuff?
Well, I'm sure we can get by. It's whether we want to be a bit better a bit more often. And going back to the learning and development agenda, people so often say to me, if you come and do a course, we'll get our leaders in there, or we'll get our senior middle management in there. And that's often how you have to start. The really, really exciting ones is when you actually do something vertically and actually get people to learn together. And all of a sudden you get people at different parts of that generational spectrum working together and understanding, do you know what, the one common bond here is we're all humans. Regardless of my generation, we are human.
It's absolutely well said, and I think that's where it's mindset, isn't it? And it's mindset on all levels.
It's bravery.
Right.
It's bravery to do
Interesting.
that. You have to have the right culture and the bravery, in my view. Some organisations we've tried it with and tough.
Yes.
Because they're not ready for it. They're just not ready. And other organisations, it is just accelerates them to a new level.
And I think that's that. From that perspective, a lot of it as well comes down to how open them leaders are, or them execs are, to consider a different platform and remove a bit of ego, you could argue, right?
Yeah.
To just open up to us as human beings and not look at hierarchical. But obviously hierarchy does have a place, but it depends on what you're trying to achieve and such. I just wonder as well, just a little story from my side going back. I recently with a client, beginning of the year, I delivered a service program to a client in the leisure industry that was opening up a massive castle hotel, which was amazing. And so I was working with about 150 teams, getting them to understand service superiority and such. And I had a group on a Tuesday night, and they were the youngest group. They were 16, 17 years of age. And I thought, this is interesting. I'm really looking forward to this. This is going to be amazing. It's my first time with that iZen generation. And I'm thinking, all these thoughts being from Gen X, I'm thinking we were taught to verbalise. We didn't have the technology, so we had to learn to problem solve, be resilient, all these things. And I thought, I wonder if they're not going to be able to communicate, because they're brought up on their own devices. And what really I was astounded by was actually they wanted them communication skills, and they were blown away when I was teaching them and going through things such as how we communicate and how the guest or the customer would perceive us and how we can relate to them and such, and the little techniques we need. They absorbed that information so well, and they were just craving out. They were staring at me as if it was a TED Talks type thing, you know, and it was just one of the most amazing experiences I've had with that generation. And I think there's some research you found this week which was about you know, what is these soft skills that these youngsters are looking for, and a lot of it was communication skills. So I think we've got to try and help this generation, haven't we? Because we make an assumption that they don't want to communicate, but actually they do. They just don't know how to, because they're not brought up on it.
And with the other generation, wouldn't it be great just to teach them, if you just press that button there, you communicate with everyone, as opposed to that being a barrier. Right. So there is this great potential if we can bring people together.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that is the beauty of, you know, teamwork, isn't it? And I think there's still a lot of space in the business world to pull people together and do some team generation stuff. So thank you for answering them questions. Superb insight, Simon. But I think what's really interesting now, we're going to go on to our fun part of the show, in my view, which is Beat the Griff.
Yeah. Well,
so it's quiz time. Over to Davies.
Well, I've designed this amazing quiz. I really have. I thought we need a kind of real USP for this quiz. So I went on your website, in fact, Graham, and found a picture of you and printed it out and put it on a piece of card. And I thought, I don't need the stick underneath, because I can just hold on like that.
That's shocking, isn't it? That's shocking.
It. So I thought,
very creative.
2 against 1 now. And that was my only kind of idea, really. Other than that, it's just some questions that one of my students printed off for me. So it's first to 3. All kinds of topics. More multiple choice, though. I'm going to allow the question to be handed over if it's answered incorrectly. So we're going to get to the answer of whichever question.
And just to state for the record, I am not involved in any of this. I have no clue what questions you've got. Neither does Simon. So it's a very open forum. So this is where me and Simon get nervous, and certainly his first beat is going to go through the roof at this point.
It is. We've got time on this.
So we're just over half an hour in. If you do want to go back and track if this data is published, then making sure there's nothing untoward. Okay, the questions are all over the shop. There, you might look,
Get myself prepared.
Ready? First question to Griff.
Okay, here we go.
Right.
Okay. Come on.
What colour is gin? And what colour is gin? Is it A, colourless, B, blue, C, green, or D, yellow?
I think it's colourless.
Final answer.
Final answer.
Graham Griffin. Gin is indeed colourless.
Yes!
So you get 1 point, so that's a bit of a head
Get
start.
in there.
GG and SS.
I would have gone blue, but I'd something.
Alright, that's enough. You just get to
Okay,
the question.
right,
You don't get to do anything else.
That's a trick question, that, isn't it?
Yeah, it was.
There's no time break. If you get all yours right, you just can't win, Simon. It's that.
I don't think I could win anyway somehow. But
Okay,
go on.
Kind of food, drink related question for you as well, to make sure it's completely fair. Cool difficulty. Which nuts are used to make marzipan? A, almonds, B, chestnuts, C, hazelnuts, or D, walnuts?
That's almonds, I think.
Final answer.
Final answer.
It is indeed almonds.
Whoa!
The equaliser.
Get in,
Netbuster.
Simon. Wow.
Right,
I wouldn't
okay.
have known that, by the way, but yeah.
Funny how you know so much about gym.
Yeah, that's right, yeah, funny enough.
Right, here we go.
Okay, here we go.
Put it in baseball-based question.
Ooh, interesting.
With which baseball team did Joe DiMaggio achieve icon status in the 1940s?
Oh my gosh, what a question.
Was it A, the Chicago Bears, B,
Yeah.
the New York Yankees, C, the Baltimore Batters, or D, the Cleveland Steelers?
I've got to go with the New York Yankees.
Sure.
It's the only one that would make sense to me.
Simon's body, you are indeed right.
Oh,
That's
yes.
2-1.
Woo!
Okay.
It's an American football team that Mary put.
Did it?
Yeah.
Which one was it?
Chicago Bears.
Chicago Bears. Is that a football team or baseball team?
What's this? American football was the kind of egg-shaped one.
It's a
isn't it?
team.
It's a team.
It's a team.
Egg-shaped one.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so what?
Oh, here we are, we've had a little. So now we're into sports, aren't we? And this one's for you, Simon. Okay, you ready?
Yeah, go.
Okay. Who revolutionised high jumping when he used the flop technique to win an Olympic gold medal in Mexico in 1968? Was it A, Dick Fosby?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes,
Oh,
you're
no
right.
way,
Look at that.
really?
Didn't even need the answers
Wow,
there.
I never would have
Didn't
got that.
even need the answers there. Okay.
That is superb.
I've run out of questions.
Have you?
No, I haven't. No, I haven't. I haven't run out
This
of
to
questions.
win.
Okay.
This is it.
This is to win.
Drum
This
roll.
is to win. Right.
Here we
Okay.
go. Come on.
Sort of astronomy ones here.
Oh,
Oh no.
How's astronomy?
My goodness, that is straight away.
Okay. Which planet is said to influence the way we communicate? Is it
Okay.
A, Venus, B, Mercury, C, Mars, or D, Saturn?
I'm gonna go with Mercury.
Go with Mercury.
Yeah.
Okay, it is indeed B, Mercury.
Is it?
All right.
Oh.
It seems grossly unfair, though, really.
Why?
Because
You've
Tom,
still,
you
got
could
to
have
ask,
won.
you've still got to ask him the final question.
Well, so
surely.
I'm changing the rules. Rules have changed. So now,
I'm
got
quite happy.
three
I'll take
questions
it
easy.
graciously. As a Southampton fan, 3-2 loss is actually really quite good, you know.
Oh.
I think we can have that. I think we've got to go. We've got to go for this.
We've
and
got to
then-
go for one question.
I would do it for time. I don't want. Yeah, I think this is the best possible use of time rather than
Yeah.
draw on Sam's expertise. Just ask these questions that my students have written. Okay, these ones aren't multiple choice, but that's fine. What is the national sport in Japan?
Sumo wrestling.
3-3. We've got to go to the tie break.
Right, so we're on a tie break. Okay, we've done well. 3 questions each. Tie break. So that means we get 1 question each, or 1 question for us both to answer.
Means you've got to play spoof.
Oh, okay. Come on then.
I have an honourable draw.
You can draw it. Well, I'll tell you what. You can. Because I want to hear more from Simon than play spoof.
Okay,
We'll play spoof after the podcast. That's
Okay,
your
right,
expertise.
yeah.
Good job. So the champion is both of us.
Well
Woo!
done, friend.
3-3 draw. And what we'll do, Simon, we're eventually going to get a leaderboard, and
Okay.
then we're going to have on there Simon Shepard, your score, my score. So that'll be 3-3.
3-3.
And we'll
Okay.
eventually, yeah, throw
Very
that
good.
down, which is excellent. So thank you for that. I thought I was going to get a
It's
9.
like sports day, isn't it? Everyone's a winner.
Yeah.
Everyone's a winner.
Which I'm like, no, there's got to be a winner. Let's do something else. Okay, so brilliant. Thank you,
Well, you're
Davis.
welcome, yeah.
Very good preparation and such.
Super.
So I think we're coming to the end now. We've still got a bit more to talk about, and I think we'll get into our final thoughts. We'll come back to you, Tom, and wrap up your thoughts on what you've found from a pod perspective, so people, organisation development perspective, and I'll gather my thoughts and we'll talk a little bit more about what's next. But I think we're going to give a few minutes back to yourself, Simon, to talk a little bit about what was your final thought and what you've said, and if there's anything else you want to share about what you're doing, because I think it's not only a fantastic idea, it's actually something that I think can benefit a lot of organisations and individuals. So over to you, final thoughts on everything we've talked about so far and what you'd like our viewers to take away.
Well, I'm going to reflect on something that a chap called David Young taught me. And David Young's the psychologist who's been involved with England cricket over this World Cup campaign. And he did some very interesting research where he looked at the relationship between performance, expectation and support. And of course, most of us want to perform well. Most of us want to do well in life. But what David found was that if high expectation is placed on someone and high support is given, then high performance is often achieved. But if high expectation is placed on someone and low support given, that's the worst of the worst. In fact, you're better off, if you're going to put low support in place, having low expectation. Your performance marks will be better. At least it's an authentic position to be. So I guess my final thought is, if we're putting high support on ourselves, high expectation on ourselves, then how are we supporting ourselves? Because we're actually in many ways a contributing factor in what we will achieve. And that's sort of a little bit of the ethos around what we've sort of recently set up with Living Life Better, is to help individuals with either their health or their well-being or their performance, or if they've got an ambition to achieve, what support can be put in place, what network of people, what expertise is right on your doorstep that could help you be a bit better a bit more often, and ultimately say you are living life better. So
that is superb. That's well said. And I mean, from my side, just listening in on that, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we're in a business setting, sometimes we're driven to put a strategy in place, and we've got to achieve X, Y, and Z. But we spend little time on how that's going to happen and how that's going to be achieved, and what resources, be it people or financial, enable us to get to that point. And I've never heard that before, to be honest. I think that's fantastic to say. We're going to go for high expectations, but what are the support mechanisms to get there? And actually, if there's no support mechanisms in there, are we setting up the business or individuals to fail? Which means the expectation needs to be quite low. So I think fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to Simon today, and I suppose naturally I've related it to things that I've done, but straight away, and I must say that I feel teachers in general do an absolutely superb job. They're working incredibly hard, but sometimes that difference between that expectation and support, there is a gap there, although I've never thought of it in those terms before. Simon's come here today, so that's incredibly powerful, and with what I'm doing now, again, I can really relate to how just considering some of the ideas that Simon's brought to the table today would make huge differences to not just people running small business like myself, but cuts right across, organisations of various sizes. And I couldn't help myself. It probably came across as a bit impolite, but I was having a look at Simon's Living Life Better website as well, and there's a great tool on there that can kind of score different elements of how you're living your life at the moment. And my mind's been racing across all those areas, so I've got lots of things to consider and digest, and I'll certainly drill down deeper into that. But thank you for coming along today, Simon. It's been really informative and certainly challenged some of the thoughts that I held. So thank you for that.
pleasure. Thank you.
Superb. And I think to wrap up for the whole show, this first series as well, is that what we're trying to achieve is get out to as many people in the audience from a perspective who these conversations might help. So we're looking at everybody coming into the workplace. People may be unemployed that might think to themselves, we need a bit of skill sets here to help us out. What can I get from lived experiences? We've all been there, we've all started out on our first journey, couldn't get the experience, and then we started somewhere and we built something, and we'll explore more of what skill sets I've got, and Simon shared a lot with us today. Right through to people who might want to get a promotion, or right through to people in the workplace that might just want to do better for themselves. That's what's really important, isn't it? To give them a real good balance of well-being. Right through to senior managers in business, small, medium or large, right through to them decision makers, them chief execs, and we've all met them, been involved, and we're doing certain aspects of ourselves, running our own businesses and such. But if we can get to that point where we can share this on a platform and actually get people to be better, there's a bigger picture here, isn't there, which is for PLC UK, we want to be healthier, we want to be better, and we want to be probably one of the most productive countries work output wise in the whole of Europe in particular. So I think hopefully this has helped today. I think thanks to Simon, I'd certainly advocate his work and what he's doing. If we could get Simon in every business, how amazing would that be? From a point of view of well-being, as well as mental health, as well as obviously organisation development. So it's all holistically linked, and I think that's what's really powerful. Some key messages: collaboration, communication, we've heard, certainly from a sporting background, certainly from a business background. So thank you for your time. We will continue with more episodes in this series, and we'll be releasing an episode with our guest speakers every 3 weeks or 4 weeks. We'd welcome your feedback. Your feedback would be crucial. You can do that through our YouTube platform. As many comments as possible. Give us some feedback how helpful this has been for you. And eventually what we'd like to do is get as much interest where we can do a live audience and you guys can vote our top 3 speakers, and we can do something live to drive this whole performance and help business and people, and that's really, really powerful. So thank you, Simon. Thank you, Davies. Anything else to wrap up on? Final word?
If someone wants to get in touch with you, Simon, I mean, I've scored 55% on here, and I feel so to bring it full circle with the 55%, what would they do?
Yeah, just get in contact with us via the website www.livinglifebetter.uk or www.optima-life.com.
Super stuff. Yeah.
Super. Thank you, guys, and we'll see you shortly. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.